My uncle was going to force my 11-year-old cousin into marriage, so I stood up and spoke out. 2 years later, half the family is in jail, and the other half wants me to pretend it never happened. I taught my cousins a language that changed our lives forever. You see, my family had this rule about women and silence. A woman's voice was considered poison after her 16th birthday. The silent ceremony happened at midnight. Your father holds you down while your mother sews a red thread across your lips. Not literally, but you wore that thread on your wrist as a reminder. Break the rule once, they'll lock you in the laundry room without food. Break it twice, they'll pull a tooth. Nobody broke it 3 times. Women's silence was like a currency. Whichever man had the quietest house was the most praised in society. At family gatherings, my uncles would compete like kids showing off baseball cards. Mira hasn't made a sound since January, Uncle Dev would boast, spreading his fingers. In response, Uncle Raj would lean back, smirking. That's nothing. Priya's going on 2 years. When the doctor asked her a question at her checkup, she just pointed at me to answer. It actually sounds crazy saying it out loud, but for so long, this is just the way things were. And I myself was the loudest person I knew. I couldn't even get through a conversation without laughing at something the other person said, even if it wasn't meant to be funny. I loved singing lyrics out loud and making weird sounds with my friends, so I knew if I didn't find an answer soon, then my life would be over. But I wanted the problem to go away by itself. And one day, it did. I was sitting in 7th grade when Mr. Brown told us that we needed to take a foreign language. My ears perked up, because ASL, American Sign Language, counted. You see, the whole time me and my family were in the USA, because it wasn't until you turned 16 and made the vow of silence before you were sent back to the motherland. And there, you were forced to settle down and have kids. So 3 times a week, I sat in Ms. Brown's classroom learning to speak with my hands. Adrenaline pumped through my veins. If she so much as texted my parents about my choice of language, they'd find out what I was up to, and my life would be over. I even didn't know what I was going to do with the lessons, because no one around me spoke the language. But then came Diwali dinner. All our relatives flew in from the motherland to eat at our house. It was supposed to be the happiest time of the year. But during the meal, I noticed Priya sitting by herself at the end of the table. There were tears silently streaming down her face, and she was unable to tell anyone why. She was 17, a year into her silence. When no one was looking, I handed her a glass of water with a note in my hand. Meet me by the garden shed. Bring your sister. I told everyone that I noticed her sari was wrinkled, and I was going to teach her how to fold it properly in the shed. That's how it started. Every family gathering, while the men watched cricket and the silenced women served food, me and the younger girls would cluster together, all desperate to avoid our fate. I taught them letters first, then words. Then we had whole conversations flowing between our fingers. We got creative with practice locations, signing while washing dishes, our hands hidden in soapy water. We developed our own secret gesture. A flick of the wrist meant, he's coming. A thumb brush meant, save this conversation for later. By the time I turned 15, we had a full network. 12 girls between the ages of 9 and 15, all fluent in a language our fathers and brothers couldn't understand. The older women noticed but said nothing. Others started learning by watching us. Everything crashed down at my cousin Anjali's wedding. She was 15, marrying a 65-year-old man who'd specifically chosen her for her early, well-trained silence. We were halfway through the ceremony when I noticed her 11-year-old sister glaring right at me. When I looked down at her hands, she signed, he hits her. She showed me the bruises. I watched Anjali standing there in her red wedding sari, unable to object to her own marriage. Something in me snapped. As he started the final vow, I stood up and spoke. But this time it wasn't in sign language. It was out loud. She doesn't want this marriage. He's been hurting her. My mother's face turned ghost white. There were gasps all around me. The room exploded. 200 guests staring as I broke the cardinal rule. My father grabbed my arm, hissing about shame and consequences, but he froze in his tracks, because 6 other girls stood up, some speaking for the first time in years. We know about the beatings, one exclaimed. This is effing illegal, another one shouted. That's when I heard sirens outside. Through the window, I saw 2 police cars and a CPS van. Someone had called them about a marriage in progress. I never found out who. The police came in and started asking questions. They separated Anjali from everyone else, leading her to a quiet corner. The groom tried to slip out the back door, but an officer stopped him. My father kept squeezing my arm harder, leaving marks that would bruise later. The other men were yelling at their daughters who had spoken up, their faces red with rage. The CPS workers took Anjali into another room. I could see through the doorway as they examined her arms. She was crying and nodding, finally able to tell her truth. One of the workers was taking photos of the bruises. The police started writing down names and asking for IDs, their presence making the air feel electric with tension. My uncle Dev pushed through the crowd and grabbed his daughter by the hair. She screamed and a police officer immediately intervened, pulling them apart. That made everything worse. Now they were watching all of us more closely. The men couldn't discipline their daughters with the authorities there, and their frustration was palpable. The lead officer announced they were shutting down the wedding. He said something about investigating reports of abuse and underage marriage. The groom, seeing the police were now occupied with the growing chaos of families arguing and officers trying to maintain order, slipped away during the commotion. Nobody tried to stop him this time. My father dragged me toward the car, his grip never loosening. He wasn't saying anything, but I could feel his anger radiating off him in waves. My mother followed behind us, clutching her prayer beads so tightly her knuckles were white. She hadn't looked at me once since I spoke up. The other families were leaving too, pulling their daughters along. The parking lot a chaos of slamming doors and revving engines. In the car, my father's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. He said I had destroyed our family's reputation, that we could never show our faces again. He said the other men would never respect him again. My mother just kept praying under her breath, the Sanskrit words barely audible. I stared out the window and tried not to cry, watching the city lights blur past. At home, he marched me straight to my room. He took my phone and laptop, shoving them into his pockets. He said I would stay there until he figured out what to do with me. The door locked from the outside with a click that sounded final. I heard him storm downstairs and start making calls, his voice voice carrying through the floorboards. Through the air vent, I could hear him talking to my uncles. He was warning them about the police asking questions. He told them to keep their daughters away from school for a few days until things calmed down. He mentioned something about an emergency family meeting at grandfather's house. I tried to sleep but kept thinking about Anjali. I wondered where they took her, if she was safe now. I hoped she was safe. I thought about the other girls who spoke up. Their fathers were probably doing the same thing mine was, locking them away like dangerous secrets. Around midnight, I heard a soft knock. My Aunt Mira slipped inside with a plate of food, rice and dal, still warm. She was one of the silenced women, but she touched my face gently. She pointed to the food and then to her heart. I understood she was proud of me, even if she could never say it. She pulled out her phone and showed me messages. My cousins were texting each other in a group chat I didn't know existed. They were thanking me for speaking up, but they were also scared. Some of them were already locked in their rooms too. Their fathers were furious, threatening to send them back early. My aunt left as quietly as she came. I ate the food and tried to think clearly. I knew this was just the beginning. The men would regroup and come up with a plan. They always did when their authority was challenged. They would find a way to reassert control. The next morning, my father unlocked my door at dawn. He told me to get dressed in my best sari, the blue one with gold embroidery. We were going to my grandfather's house. All the men would be there for counsel. I knew this was bad. Grandfather was the one who started the silence tradition in our family 3 generations ago. The drive took 2 hours through winding country roads. My father didn't speak the whole way. My mother came too, but she sat in the back, still clutching those prayer beads. I watched the city turn into countryside, the buildings giving way to fields and forests. My grandfather lived in a big house away from everyone, isolated and imposing. When we arrived, I counted 20 cars in the driveway. All my uncles were there. Some cousins I hadn't seen in years had driven through the night to attend. Only the men, though. They were gathered in the main room, sitting in a circle on cushions. My grandfather sat in his chair like a king holding court. They made me stand in the middle of the circle. My grandfather asked me to explain myself. I told him about Anjali's bruises, keeping my voice steady. I said the marriage was wrong, that she was just a child. He laughed and said I was too young to understand our ways, that I had been corrupted by American ideas. The interrogation went on for hours. They asked who taught me to be so disrespectful. They wanted names of every girl who knew sign language. I kept saying I only spoke about Anjali, nothing else. My uncle Raj stood up and said I was lying, that I had poisoned all their daughters' minds. His face was red with anger, veins bulging at his temples as he paced back and forth like a caged animal. The room felt suffocating. My grandfather sat at the head of the long wooden table, his fingers steepled in front of him. The other men, my father, my uncles, various male cousins old enough to have a voice in family matters, formed a semicircle around me. The overhead light cast harsh shadows on their faces, making them look like strangers instead of family. Then they started bringing in my cousins one by one. First was Priya's younger sister Kavya, only 12 years old. She was shaking like a leaf, her small frame drowning in an oversized salwar kameez. Her usually bright eyes were wide with terror. My grandfather asked her if she knew sign language. She looked at me and then at the floor, her lips trembling. Her father slapped the back of her head and told her to answer. The sound echoed in the room. She nodded yes, tears streaming down her face, and I wanted to wrap her in my arms and tell her it would be okay, but I couldn't move from my chair. They brought in 8 more girls. Some admitted to learning ASL right away, their voices barely above whispers. Others tried to deny it until their fathers threatened them with consequences I didn't want to imagine. Maya, who was 14, held out the longest, insisting she knew nothing until her father grabbed her wrist so hard she cried out. The youngest was Asha, only 9. She didn't even understand why she was in trouble. She just kept crying for her mother who wasn't allowed in the room, her small voice calling mama over and over until her father told her to be quiet. My grandfather declared this was an infection that needed to be cut out. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind that had ruled our family for decades. He said all the girls who learned sign language would undergo the silent ceremony immediately. It didn't matter that some were years away from 16. He said desperate times called for desperate measures. The other men nodded in agreement, some enthusiastically, others with what looked like reluctance they didn't dare voice. They separated us into different rooms. I was taken to the basement, a cold concrete space with one small window near the ceiling that let in just enough light to remind me the outside world still existed. The walls were unpainted cinder blocks that seemed to absorb any warmth. There was a thin mattress on the floor that smelled of mildew, and a bucket in the corner that I didn't want to think about. My grandfather said I would stay there until I learned proper respect. The door was thick wood with a heavy lock that clicked with finality when he left. The first night was the worst. The concrete floor radiated cold through the thin mattress. I could hear the house settling above me, creaking and groaning like it was digesting what had happened. Every sound made me jump. Footsteps, muffled voices, doors opening and closing. I wrapped myself in the single rough blanket they'd left and tried not to think about spiders or mice or how long they planned to keep me here. For 3 days, they kept me down there. Twice a day, someone would bring rice and water. The rice was always cold, sometimes with a few pieces of dal mixed in, served on a steel plate that clanged against the concrete when they set it down. No one spoke to me. I could hear footsteps above, muffled voices that might have been arguing or might have been normal conversation. It was impossible to tell through the floorboards. Sometimes I heard crying that might have been my younger cousins. The sound made my chest tight with guilt and anger. I did push-ups and jumping jacks to stay warm and sane. I counted them obsessively. 20 push-ups, 50 jumping jacks, then start over. I recited poetry I'd memorized for school, sang songs under my breath, practiced ASL signs against the wall where no one could see. I marked the passage of time by the small rectangle of sunlight that moved across the floor from the window. When it disappeared each evening, the darkness felt absolute. On the 4th morning, I heard a car pull up. The engine sound was different from the family cars I recognized. Then voices I didn't recognize. A woman asking for me by name, her tone professional and insistent. My grandfather's voice, smooth as honey, saying I had had the flu and was resting. The woman insisted on seeing me. She said she was my counselor from school. Ms. Brown had come looking for me. My heart leaped with hope and fear simultaneously. I heard arguing. My grandfather's voice rose slightly, losing some of its controlled smoothness. Mr. Brown's remained steady, using words like mandatory reporter and welfare check. Then footsteps coming down to the basement, quick and angry. My grandfather unlocked the door and hissed at me to make myself presentable. The sudden light from the stairway made me squint. He threw a clean sorry at me and told me to change quickly. He said if I tried anything, my cousins would pay the price. His eyes were cold as winter stones. I changed with shaking hands, trying to smooth my tangled hair with my fingers. The clean clothes felt strange after days in the same outfit. My grandfather waited outside the door, tapping his foot impatiently. When I emerged, he grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks and marched me up the stairs. They brought me upstairs. Ms. Brown was standing in the living room with her arms crossed, her usually warm face set in hard lines. She looked me up and down, taking in my messy hair and pale skin, the dark circles under my eyes. She asked if I was okay. I nodded and said I'd been sick but was feeling better, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. My grandfather stood right behind me, his hand heavy on my shoulder, fingers digging in just enough to remind me of his presence. Ms. Brown asked why I hadn't been answering my phone. My grandfather smoothly said I'd been resting without electronics, doctor's orders for a bad migraine. She didn't look convinced. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she studied us both. She asked to speak to me privately. My grandfather said that wasn't appropriate in our culture, that unmarried girls didn't meet alone with outsiders. She stared at him for a long moment, and I could see her processing this information, filing it away. Then she looked directly at me. She asked if I remembered what we learned last week in ASL class. My heart pounded so loud I was sure everyone could hear it. I knew this was my chance. While my grandfather couldn't see, I signed help as clearly as I could, my fingers moving in the familiar pattern we'd practiced. Her expression didn't change, but I saw her notice, saw the slight widening of her eyes before she controlled her face. She said she hoped I'd be back in class soon and left. The moment her car disappeared down the driveway, my grandfather backhanded me. The force of it snapped my head to the side, and I tasted blood where my teeth cut my cheek. He'd seen my reflection in the window. He called me a stupid girl and said I'd just made things worse for everyone. He threw me back in the basement, shoving me so hard I stumbled on the stairs. I heard him making more phone calls, his voice urgent and angry. That night I couldn't sleep. My face throbbed where he'd hit me, and I kept replaying Ms. Brown's visit. Had she understood? Would she come back? Or had I just made things worse like my grandfather said? I pressed my back against the cold wall and tried not to cry. The next day, Ms. Brown came back. This time she brought a social worker named Janet, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. They said they were doing a welfare check, that it was standard procedure when a student missed multiple days. My grandfather had no choice but to let them in, though his smile was strained. He quickly called some of the aunts to make the house look normal. Within minutes, they started cooking and cleaning like it was a regular day, filling the air with the smell of spices and the sound of normalcy. They cleaned me up again, my aunt roughly brushing my hair and pinching my cheeks to bring color to them. They dressed me in a bright blue salwar kameez and coached me on what to say. My aunt whispered that if I didn't cooperate, they'd already picked out husbands for all of us. She showed me photos on her phone, men in their 30s and 40s, some already married, all from traditional families back home. They'd ship us back within the week. I sat in the living room trying to look normal while my insides churned with fear and rage. The social worker asked me questions about school and home. I gave the rehearsed answers while my grandfather watched from his chair, his presence like a weight in the room. But I'd hidden my ASL notebook in my lap under a cushion. When I shifted positions to answer a question about my favorite subjects, I let it fall. The pages scattered across the floor, revealing months of sign language practice, notes about teaching my cousins, drawings of hands forming words. Janet bent to pick it up and saw pages covered in sign language practice. She slowly gathered each page, taking her time, studying them. She handed it back to me with a small nod that my grandfather couldn't see. She took photos of the house, saying it was standard procedure, her camera clicking steadily. She photographed the locks on doors, the bars on windows that my grandfather claimed were for security. She mentioned they'd be back for follow-up visits. My grandfather's jaw clenched, but he smiled and said they were always welcome, that they had nothing to hide. After they left, everything moved fast. My grandfather called an emergency family meeting. He said the ceremony would happen that night, that they couldn't wait any longer. He called all the families to come immediately. He said the outside world was trying to destroy our traditions, and we had to act quickly. The men started preparing the main room, moving furniture, laying out ceremonial items with practiced efficiency. They brought us girls up from our various hiding spots. We looked rough, unwashed hair, wrinkled clothes, hollow eyes that had seen too much. Some girls had bruises they tried to hide. They made us bathe and dress in white saris. White for purity, they said. White like ghosts. White like surrender. The fabric felt heavy against my skin. They lined us up by age in the preparation room. I was the oldest, so I would go first. I looked at the others. Kavya still trembling. Maya defiant but scared. Little Asha confused and wanting her mother. The room filled with relatives as the sun set, casting long shadows through the windows. The men sat in the inner circle on cushions, their faces solemn with the weight of tradition. The silenced women stood against the walls like sentinels, their red threads visible on their wrists, their eyes downcast. On a low table sat silver plates with red thread and scissors. The ceremonial items gleamed in the lamplight, tools of a tradition that had stolen voices for generations. My stomach turned looking at them. My grandfather started chanting in Sanskrit, his voice deep and rhythmic. The other men joined in, their voices creating a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to make the air vibrate. They lit incense that made the air thick and hard to breathe, sandalwood and something else that made my head swim. The smoke curled up toward the ceiling like grasping fingers. My father approached with the red thread. His hands were shaking slightly, but his face was stone. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I looked at my cousins. Some were crying silently, tears rolling down their cheeks. Others stared straight ahead, already practicing their silence. The youngest one was sucking her thumb, a habit she'd broken years ago. I thought about Anjali, wherever she was now. I thought about all the women lining the walls, decades of silence pressed between them like flowers in a book. I thought about Mrs. Brown and Janet, somewhere out there in a world where women's voices mattered. I made my decision. When my father reached for me, I signed now to the other girls. We'd practiced this in whispers and gestures when the adults weren't looking. We scattered in every direction. The men weren't expecting it. We'd planned escape routes, memorized which windows opened, which doors led where. Some girls ran for the doors, others headed for windows. The room erupted in chaos. White saris flashed like birds taking flight. I sprinted toward the kitchen where I knew there was a back door. My Uncle Dev caught my cousin near the stairs, his hand closing on her dupatta. She twisted away, leaving the scarf in his hands. Two girls made it outside before being grabbed in the yard. I could hear shouting and crying everywhere. My sari tangled around my legs, slowing me down. I hiked it up, not caring about propriety anymore. I burst into the kitchen. The women were there, preparing food like they always did during ceremonies. Pots bubbled on the stove, and the familiar smell of dal and rice filled the air. They looked up in shock. I begged them to help us, words tumbling out of my mouth. Most looked away, trained by years of fear, their hands continuing their work automatically. But my Aunt Mira stepped forward. She'd always been different, quieter in her rebellion. She blocked the doorway as my father appeared, breathing hard from the chase. He ordered her to move. She shook her head, a simple gesture that seemed to shake the foundations of our world. Another aunt joined her, then another. Slowly, the silenced women formed a wall between us and the men. For the first time in decades, they were choosing a side. My father tried to push through, but they locked arms, their red threads like a chain binding them together. That's when my grandmother appeared. She never came to ceremonies anymore, staying in her room with her memories and her photographs of a life before silence. But she stood there now, 90 years old and fierce. Her white hair was loose around her shoulders instead of in its usual bun. She still wore her red thread from when she was silenced at 16. The fabric had faded over the decades, but never broken. She reached up and pulled it off her wrist with arthritis-gnarled fingers. She spoke for the first time in 40 years. Her voice was raspy but clear, like a door opening on rusty hinges. She told her sons to stop. She said she'd watched this tradition destroy too many lives, had seen too many bright girls dimmed. She said she'd stayed silent when they silenced her daughters, but she wouldn't watch it happen to her granddaughters. Her words filled the room like water breaking through a dam. The room went completely still. Even the pots on the stove seemed to quiet their bubbling. My grandfather stared at his mother like she was a stranger. She walked through the crowd of men who parted before her like she was parting the sea. Her steps were slow but steady. She took the scissors from the ceremonial plate and cut each red thread into pieces. The sound of cutting seemed impossibly loud. Then she turned to the women lining the walls. She told them they could speak. She said their silence had given the men too much power for too long. She said she'd spent 40 years regretting her silence, 40 years of words rotting in her throat. One by one, the women began removing their threads. Some cried as they did it, decades of suppressed emotion pouring out. Others laughed, the sound rusty and beautiful. My mother pulled hers off and said my name for the first time in years. The sound of it made me cry. The men didn't know what to do. They were outnumbered now, and more importantly, the moral authority they'd claimed was crumbling. Some uncles tried to grab their wives, but the women stood together. My aunt told her husband she would leave and take their daughters if he tried to continue. She'd already packed bags, she said, had been planning for years. Other women made similar threats. The revolution we'd started with sign language had become something bigger. My grandfather ordered everyone to stop. His voice had lost its power, sounding almost plaintive. He said traditions existed for a reason, that they'd kept our culture strong, but his own mother laughed at him, a sound like bells ringing. She asked what reason justified stealing women's voices. She asked if he'd ever wondered what his wife would have said all those years if she could speak. She asked if he knew his daughter's favorite colors, their dreams, their fears. His silence was answer enough. The ceremony fell apart like a house of cards. Families started arguing, years of resentment spilling out. Some men tried to maintain control, but their wives were done listening. My father looked lost as my mother told him exactly what she thought of his weakness. She said he'd hidden behind tradition instead of thinking for himself. She said she'd loved him once, but didn't know if she still did. She'd need to relearn who she was with a voice. Over the next weeks, everything changed. The family that had seemed so solid, so eternal, revealed its cracks. Some families split apart completely. Die-hard traditionalists cut ties with those who abandoned the silence rules. My cousins were shuffled between relatives as parents figured out where they stood. The network of girls stayed strong, texting constantly, sharing resources and support. We created a secret Facebook group where we could talk freely. Ms. Brown helped several girls report abuse to the authorities. She connected us with counselors and lawyers who understood cultural contexts but wouldn't accept culture as an excuse for abuse. Some cases went forward, others didn't. But the threat was enough to make some men reconsider their actions. The community couldn't hide anymore. Local news picked up the story. Reporters called asking for interviews. My parents barely spoke to me at first. The house felt different, like the walls were learning to accommodate new sounds. Then my mother started making my favorite foods, aloo paratha with extra butter, the mango kulfi she used to make when I was small. She asked about school in her unused voice, stumbling over words. She told me stories about her own childhood, before the silence, about how she'd wanted to be a teacher, how she'd loved to sing. My father took longer, but eventually he asked to see what I'd learned in ASL. His fingers were clumsy as I taught him to sign, "I'm sorry." Some cousins went to live with relatives who'd already abandoned the old ways. Others stayed with parents who were slowly changing. A few were sent back to the motherland, but they had phones now and stayed in touch. We kept teaching each other ASL just in case, but also because it had become our language of rebellion, our secret freedom. My grandmother became our unexpected champion. She visited families and spoke about her decades of enforced silence. She told the men how much they'd missed by not hearing their wives' thoughts. She told them about the poems she'd composed in her head, the jokes she'd wanted wanted to share, the advice she'd wanted to give. She told the women they were stronger than they knew. Some listened, others didn't, but she kept talking, making up for 40 years of silence. At the next family gathering, everything felt different. It was Diwali, usually our biggest celebration. Half the usual people didn't come, but the ones who did brought their voices. Women talked and laughed, their words mixing with the fireworks outside. Some still wore their threads by choice, but it was choice now. The men seemed smaller somehow, no longer the only ones allowed to speak. They had to make space for other voices. Anjali was there with her sister. She was living with progressive cousins and going to school. She still had nightmares, but she was healing. She'd cut her hair short in defiance of tradition and wore jeans instead of traditional clothes. She thanked me for speaking up. I told her we all did it together. Without the other girls standing up too, nothing would have changed. We were each other's voices when we had none of our own. We still taught sign language, but now it was just another way to communicate. Some mothers learned it to talk to daughters who were still finding their voices after years of silence. We created signs for feelings that had been buried too long, signs for the particular frustration of unspoken words, for the joy of first speech, for the fear that still lingered. The language that started as rebellion became healing. My father apologized months later. We were sitting in the garden where he'd taught me to ride a bike, where we'd planted tomatoes together when I was 7. He said he'd followed traditions without thinking because that's what his father did. He said watching my mother find her voice again showed him what he'd been missing. He said he was proud of me for being braver than he'd ever been. He still struggled with the changes, but he was trying. Not everyone changed. Some families dug in deeper, moving away to communities that still practiced the old ways. They called us corrupted, said we'd lost our culture. Some girls were lost to us, married off quickly before they could rebel. We couldn't save everyone. The weight of that failure sat heavy on my shoulders, but we'd cracked the foundation of silence that had stood for generations, and through those cracks, voices were finally breaking free. The months after that, Diwali were weird. Some families pretended nothing had changed, while others completely fell apart. My cousin Kavya's dad tried to arrange a marriage for her even though she was only 13 now. He found some guy from back home who was 35 and owned a convenience store. He thought if he moved fast enough, he could get her married before anyone could stop him. But Kavya had learned more than just sign language from us. She recorded her dad on her phone talking about the marriage plans. She sent the recording to our group chat, and we knew we had to act fast. I called Ms. Brown and she contacted the authorities. Within 2 days, Kavya was staying with my family while her dad dealt with a visit from Child Protective Services. My house became like a halfway house for cousins escaping bad situations. My parents weren't thrilled about it at first, but my mom kept saying she wished someone had helped her at that age. We had 3 girls living with us at one point. My dad converted the basement from a storage space to a bedroom, the same basement where I'd been locked up at grandfather's house. This one had bright paint and windows and no locks on the doors. Uncle Dev showed up at our door one night demanding we return his daughter. He was hammered and angry, pounding on the door so hard the windows shook. My father actually stood up to him for the first time ever. He told Dev to leave or he'd call the police. They got into a shoving match on the front lawn. The neighbors came out to watch. Someone did call the police and Dev spent the night in jail. After that, things escalated. The traditional families started organizing. They held meetings at my grandfather's house to figure out how to regain control. Someone leaked their plans to us. They were going to pull all the girls out of school and send them back immediately. They'd already bought plane tickets for some of them. We had to move fast. Ms. Brown helped us contact a lawyer who specialized in custody issues. Some of the girls were able to file for protective orders. Others had to go into hiding with relatives who supported them. It was like a weird underground railroad for teenage girls trying to avoid forced marriages. The community split completely down the middle. At the grocery store, families would literally cross to different aisles to avoid each other. The temple had to hold 2 separate services because people refused to pray together. Some of my uncles tried to start their own temple where the old rules still applied, but they couldn't find enough people to fund it. My grandfather tried one last power move. He called a meeting of all the male elders from surrounding states. They were going to vote on whether to officially banish the families who'd abandoned the silence tradition. He thought if enough communities joined together, they could pressure everyone back in line. But my grandmother had her own plans. She'd been busy those months, talking to women in other communities. She organized a counter meeting on the same day. Women who'd been silenced for decades came from hundreds of miles away. They filled a community center we'd rented, their red threads left at home. The men's meeting had maybe 30 people. The women's meeting had over 200. My grandmother stood up and told her story again, but this time she named names. She talked about which elder had struck his wife or humming while cooking. She talked about the girl who'd culled herself rather than be silenced. She had dates and details that made the men's claims of tradition sound like what they really were: control and abuse. Some women from the other communities went home and removed their threads that same day. Their husbands called my grandfather furious, saying his family had infected theirs with rebellion. The network of support grew beyond just our family. We started getting messages from girls in other states asking how to learn sign language, how to resist. My father lost his job because his boss was one of the traditional uncles, but my mother got a job for the first time in 20 years. She worked at a daycare center, finally getting to teach like she'd always wanted. Her voice got stronger every day. She sang while cooking now, badly but happily. The next crisis came when Uncle Raj tried to kidnap his daughter from school. He showed up with 2 other men and tried to force her into a van, but the school was prepared. We'd warned them about possible attempts. They locked down immediately and called the police. He was arrested in the parking lot while his daughter watched from a classroom window. That's when things got really ugly. The traditional families started threatening anyone who helped us. Our tires got slashed. Someone threw a brick through our window. My dad installed security cameras and my mom learned to use pepper spray. We traveled in groups and checked in constantly, but we weren't backing down. The girls who'd been forced into marriages started reaching out for help. Some were able to get divorced or annulled. Others were stuck, but at least they could talk to us, could know they weren't alone. We raised money to help some of them start over. My cousin Maya became like our spokesperson. She was 16 now and fierce. She started a YouTube channel talking about our experiences. The videos went viral in our community and beyond. She got death threats but also messages from girls all over the world dealing with similar traditions. The breaking point came at my cousin Neha's 16th birthday. Her parents were traditional but wavering. They'd planned a small ceremony, not the full silencing but a symbolic thread wearing. Neha played along until the moment came. Then she stood up and gave a speech she'd been practicing for weeks. She talked about wanting to be a doctor, about having dreams that required a voice. She talked about loving her parents but not their traditions. She removed the thread they'd just tied and handed it back. Her mother started crying and then removed her own thread. Her father stood there shocked as his wife spoke his name for the first time in 20 years. That became the pattern. Girls would pretend to go along until the crucial moment, then refuse. Some families accepted it, others exploded, but each refusal made the next one easier. The tradition was dying one birthday at a time. My grandfather's health started failing. I think the loss of control broke something in him. He had a heart attack and spent weeks in the hospital. My grandmother sat by his bed and talked to him constantly, making up for all the years of silence. I don't know if he heard her, but she needed to speak. When he got out, he was different, smaller somehow. He stopped calling meetings, stopped trying to control everyone. He spent his days sitting in his garden, watching the world change without him. Sometimes I felt sorry for him, but then I remembered the basement and the fear in my cousin's eyes. The next Diwali, we held 2 celebrations, one for the traditional families, one for the rest of us. Ours was louder, full of women's voices and laughter. We could hear the other celebration across town, quiet and subdued. Some families sent members to both, trying to keep feet in both worlds. Anjali got accepted to college. She was studying pre-law, wanting to help other girls in our situation. She still had scars, physical and mental, but she was building a life. Her little sister lived with her, safe from the marriage their father had planned. My parents renewed their vows on their anniversary. This time my mother spoke her own promises instead of standing silent. She promised to never be silent again, to teach their daughters to use their voices. My father promised to listen, to value her words. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. The sign language classes continued, but now they were just for fun and communication. We taught parents and siblings, creating a truly inclusive language. Some of the older women struggled with arthritis making the signs, but they persisted. They'd waited too long to communicate freely. Ms. Brown got an award from the state for her intervention. She brought all of us girls to the ceremony. We signed thank you in unison, a sea of hands moving together. She cried and said we'd taught her more than she'd taught us. Some families moved away, unable to accept the changes. They found communities that still practiced the old ways, places where their daughters' voices would be stolen at 16. We couldn't save those girls, but we could be ready if they ever reached out for help. My grandmother passed away that spring. At her funeral, hundreds of women spoke about how she'd inspired them. They shared stories of their first words after silence, of the courage she'd given them. Even some men spoke, admitting they'd been wrong. My grandfather sat in the front row, looking lost without her voice filling his days. By the time I graduated high school, the silence tradition was mostly dead in our community. Some families held symbolic ceremonies with temporary threads, lasting a day or a week. Others abandoned it entirely. A few clung to the old ways, but they were increasingly isolated. I got into college on a scholarship, planning to study social work. I wanted to help other girls trapped by traditions that hurt them. My parents were proud, though my father still sometimes looked surprised when I spoke my mind at dinner. The network we'd built became a formal organization. We got nonprofit status and funding to help girls escape forced marriages and abuse. We ran workshops teaching sign language and self-advocacy. Some of the women who'd been silenced longest became our fiercest advocates. At my last family gathering before college, I counted voices instead of silence. 23 women speaking, laughing, arguing, singing. My youngest cousin performed a dance to a song she'd written herself. My aunts debated politics while cooking. My mother told embarrassing stories about my childhood. The men had adjusted mostly. They helped with cooking and cleaning, tasks that had been beneath them before. They listened when their wives and daughters spoke. Some still looked uncomfortable, but they were trying. Change was slow, but it was happening. I still sign sometimes when words aren't enough. The language that saved us became part of us. We teach it to every new girl in the family, just in case. But now it's a choice, not a desperate necessity. Our voices are free, and we'll never let them be silenced again. Looking at my red thread bracelet one last time before leaving for college, I cut it off and threw it away. I didn't need the reminder anymore. None of us did. We'd found our voices, and nothing would take them away again.